So thinking about the frontal lobes, we notice we've got the premotor areas in it. Now the premotor areas are in front of the motor cortex, and when we think that we want to move, these premotor areas pass the idea of thinking of wanting to move onto the motor areas which actually generate the new nerve impulse. If you like, the sort of areas which anticipate movement. So there's the premotor areas, and then we know that there's the precentral gyrus, which contains the actual motor cortex. And in the precentral gyrus, in the motor areas, there is this homunculus, the little man, who is represented, or little woman of course, who is represented in that motor area of cortex, a particular part of the cortex representing a particular part of the body. So the whole body is mapped out in that motor cortex to allow movement of the appropriate part of the body. And the primary speech area, Broca's area, is also in the frontal lobe. Reasoning and social functions, personality, abstract thinking, character, moral sense, right and wrong, wisdom, these functions are largely in the frontal lobes. And we know this because if people have their frontal lobes damaged, they can become socially disinhibited and behave in ways that the rest of us would think very inappropriate. They might behave aggressively, or they might behave sexually in an inappropriate context, because the frontal lobes are determining how we work together as individuals, how we work together in society and groups. And of course, if I'm going to behave inappropriately in terms of sexuality or aggression, then whoever I'm behaving inappropriately with will not want to work with me the next day. We need to work together as groups, and that's what the frontal lobes do. So moral sense and wisdom and things like that controlled by the frontal lobes. Of course, alcohol inhibits the frontal lobes. So if people are drunk, they often behave in inappropriate ways, ways that they will consider foolish at other times, behaving inappropriately in terms of aggression, in terms of silliness, or in terms of sexual behaviour. Ambition. These sort of things are controlled by the frontal lobes. And the frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe behind by the central sulcus. So thinking about the parietal lobes, well, we know that there's the postcentral gyrus after the central sulcus, and that the postcentral gyrus contains the sensory cortex, where the body is perceived, where we feel things. So things we feel with the body, everything we feel with the body, is felt in the sensory homunculus, in the postcentral gyrus, in the sensory cortex of the brain. Taste is also largely perceived in the parietal lobes. And proprioception means that we know where the body is in space. So if you put your hand out in front of you and close your eyes, you know that your hand is out in front of you. It is detection of where the body is in space. And in context with this three-dimensional appreciation of our bodies is three-dimensional appreciation and representation of the world. The parietal lobe allows us to say what is in front of something and what is behind. It gives us three-dimensional representation. And understanding of language, as we noticed, is in the parietal lobe, although there is a small overlap with the temporal lobe in this area that understands language, the area often referred to as Verning's area. And the use of numbers, mathematical ability, largely in the parietal lobe. Now, the temporal lobes, of course, are on the side of the brain, below the parietal lobe. And one of the things that the temporal lobe is responsible for is olfaction. That is smell. So the olfactory nerve is actually the first cranial nerve. It arises in the nose and goes back towards the temporal lobes, which generate our sense of smell. And also associated with smell is the sense of taste. The gustatory areas are also located in the temporal lobe that generate taste. So when you experience taste, that experience is generated in gustatory areas within the temporal lobe. There's auditory areas within the temporal lobe that we hear with. So the cranial nerve from the ear, the auditory nerve, is going to the temporal lobe, and that allows us to experience sound. Language is partly a function of the temporal lobe. The understanding of language, so some aspects of language comprehension are functions of the temporal lobe. And it's strange, if you electrically stimulate temporal lobes, people have surreal or what might almost be described as religious experiences. So some religious experiences could be generated by the temporal lobe, where we can experience supernatural phenomena or experience activity in the temporal lobes, depending on what you believe. But the neurological basis for transcendent experience often seems to be in the temporal lobes. And the temporal lobes are also partly limbic. Now, the limbic areas of the brain are those which generate primitive desires and emotions: fear, anxiety, aggression, sexual behaviour, appetite, drinking. These things are limbic activities, and there are limbic areas in the temporal lobe. And then finally, the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, that is what generates vision. So the optic nerves from each eye are going back towards the occipital lobes of the brain, and the image you're seeing now is generated by the neurons in the occipital lobe of the brain. Let's think now about the cerebellum. Now, cerebellum is very interesting. It's a bit like the cerebrum. It's got a folded surface. The cortex is made of grey matter. And even though it's way, way smaller than the cerebrum, it actually contains about half of the total number of neurons. So the cerebellum contains an awful lot of small nerve cells. And it's attached to the brainstem, and there are connections that go on to the thalamus from the brainstem. So what is it doing? Well, automatic learned function, skills, things we do automatically, like riding a bike or knitting or writing, things that we've learned, things that give us skills. Then it's got a role in balance and coordination, and it's involved in the maintenance of posture and fine motor control. And what the cerebellum's doing really is it's comparing and evaluating how well motor impulses, which are initiated by the motor cortex, are being carried out. So it's kind of a halfway house in a sense between the cerebrum above and the body below, making sure that the instructions from the cerebrum are correctly carried out in the body and modifying the instructions from the cerebrum as required. And that's consistent with this idea of skills and balance and maintenance of posture and things that are going on fairly automatically. It also plays a role in proprioception, receiving impulses from the joints of the body to tell us where the body is in space. And combined with the maintenance of balance, it receives information from the vestibular apparatus in the middle ear to help us balance and coordinate the whole movement and attitude of the body. Now, just before we go on to look at the diencephalon, let's just remind ourselves of some anatomy. As we've looked at before, the cerebrum, the corpus callosum, this is the area of the cerebellum here that we've just considered, and this is the diencephalon here in the centre of the cerebrum. So here we've got another diagram. Here we see the brain stem at the front. This area here is the brain stem. And as we see, this is continuous with the spinal cord. And that tells us that the foramen magnum must be just there, because the medulla oblongata starts at the foramen magnum. Then we've got the areas of the brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And this area here is the cerebellum. And of course, in this diagram, this would be looking towards the front here. And this would be the back. Because the brainstem is anterior to the cerebellum, which is posterior to the brainstem. So the diencephalon consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and another gland, another small area called the pineal gland. So the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland constitute the diencephalon. Now the thalamus consists of two thalamic nuclei, one on each half of the brain. And the thalamus is like a relay station. For example, sensory information coming up from the spinal cord goes into the thalamus, there it synapses and the information goes on to the sensory cortex where it is perceived as sensation. Another example is that the thalamus generates pain. Information that originates in nociceptors goes up the spinal cord in the spinothalamic tracts, and then the thalamus seems to generate the pain, and then the pain is, these impulses, there's other fibres go from the thalamus to the sensory cortex to localise the pain to a particular part of the body. As well as that, information from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, they go up to the thalamus, and the cerebellum, as we've looked at, controls fine motor control and skills, and the basal ganglia are involved in these fine motor controls as well. So the information goes from these structures to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus up to the motor cortex to modify the activity of the motor cortex to make sure it's given precisely the right instructions to tie up your shoelaces or to put in a suture or to do some fine work like that. And also the thalamus is probably involved in, well, the thalamus is involved to some extent in the maintenance of consciousness. So very important roles from the thalamus. Relay station, some involvement in language as well, recent memory, some involvement in emotion, in addition to the relay functions that we've just talked about. Now the hypothalamus is an amazing part of the brain, part of the diencephalon. It's got a lot of different functions. And perhaps the main thing it does, or the first thing to think about, is its role in homeostasis. So for example, when we're hungry, it's the hypothalamus that's making us feel hungry. It's got a hunger centre. And it's also got a thirst centre. If you've ever been thirsty, you'll just spend all your time looking for water till you find it. It's your hypothalamus which is driving that. The hypothalamus generates the feeling of thirst. And it also tells us when we've had enough food and when we've had enough to drink. It tells us to stop eating when we're satisfied. And then there's emotional things going on in the hypothalamus as well. Rage and anger seems to originate in the hypothalamus. And a lot of sexual drive actually originates in the hypothalamus. The desire for any form of sexual activity is primarily generated in very small areas in the hypothalamus. And then there's the homeostatic functions that people tend to know more about. Homeostasis of water balance, as we've mentioned, because of the drinking and the stopping drinking. And then temperature regulation. Some of the neurons in the hypothalamus are sensitive to temperature. And there is like a set point in the hypothalamus. And if the blood temperature drops below that set point, the hypothalamus tries to warm the body up. And the same way, if the blood temperature goes above the set point, the hypothalamus starts to cool the body down. Homeostasis of body temperature. And there's wider aspects to the physiological homeostatic role of the hypothalamus, and that is it basically controls all of the endocrine system. The releasing hormones that stimulate the trophic hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary all originate in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces these releasing hormones, and it's these releasing hormones that stimulate the trophic hormones. And of course it's the trophic hormones like thyroid stimulating hormone or adrenocorticotrophic hormone that stimulate the release of the endocrine products from the endocrine glands. So it's controlling all of the endocrine orchestra, really. In the old days we used to say that the pituitary gland was the leader of the endocrine orchestra, but actually it's the hypothalamus that's controlling everything. And as well as that, it's producing oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, the hormones which are normally released from, are released from the posterior pituitary gland, from the neurohypophysis, also produced in the hypothalamus. And it's also got circadian effects, helping us to have this normal day-night balance. That's one reason it's so hard when you change from day shift to night shift, because the normal circadian rhythms of the body are disrupted. And the final part of the diencephalon we're going to consider is the pineal gland. And I must say this gland is rather mysterious to me. We do know it produces melatonin, and this regulates the circadian rhythm in humans. In animals, it seems to play a role in seasonal reproductive activity. A lot of animals only reproduce at a particular time of the year. It's not known whether it has that effect in humans. People are starting to experiment with melatonin as a clinical drug, but at the moment all we can say with some certainty is that it is related to the circadian rhythm. So the final component of the brain we're going to talk about is the brainstem. And we already know the main components of this. The midbrain's interesting. The midbrain contains some tracts called the substantia nigra tracts. And these are involved in the transmission of nerve impulses, motor nerve impulses down into the body. And they regulate them. And they use dopamine as one of their chemical transmitter molecules. And it's largely the substantia nigra in the midbrain that goes wrong in Parkinson's disease, caused by a lack of dopamine. The medulla oblongata is probably the most interesting part of the brainstem. It contains the vasomotor centre, dilating and constricting blood vessels, thereby controlling blood pressure on a moment-by-moment basis. The respiratory centre, controlling breathing, and the cardiac centres. Now, of course, the heart has its own internal conducting system and generates the electrical impulses for its own contraction in the sinoatrial node, but it's moderated by the cardiac centre. And interesting, throughout the brainstem, imagine this area is the brainstem, you know. Now, throughout the brainstem, there's lots and lots of little neurons, like a network of very small, fine neurons. Very small, very extensive network. And this is throughout the brainstem, midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata. And this is called the reticular formation because it forms a network. A reticulum is a network. And what this seems to do is this actually seems to generate consciousness. So consciousness is generated in a structure about 3 centimetres long. It's about the size of the end joint of your thumb. Well, the medulla oblongata is that the whole brainstem is maybe the size of your thumb, and basically that means that consciousness is generated in an area of brain tissue around about the size of your thumb. The consciousness is experienced in many other parts of the brain, but it seems to be actually generated in the brainstem. And the brainstem contains the medulla contains other centres such as the vomiting centre, swallowing centre. Sneezing, coughing, hiccups, these sort of functions are carried out by stimulated by nuclei in the medulla oblongata. So, death is currently defined as death of the brainstem. So if you're working in an intensive care situation, you might come across patients that are brainstem dead. And this is a legal definition of death. And if you look after these patients, if you turn the ventilator off, if you stop ventilating, it's amazing that they just stop breathing. because the brainstem is dead. And the other part of the thinking is that because the brainstem is dead, they can't generate consciousness. So these patients are unconscious. They are essentially dead, even though their heart might still be beating. And they'll still be breathing, but only if we ventilate them. And it's patients who are brainstem dead that we take organs from for transplant. Trouble is, we never fully understand the way the brain works, so although the brainstem is generating consciousness is experienced throughout the brain. So firstly, we've got to make sure that these patients are absolutely dead. We have brainstem death criteria. And my personal thinking is, and this is only my personal thinking, it does no harm to anaesthetise these patients, because I find it hard personally to guarantee that there can be no awareness in the cerebrum independent of the brainstem. I simply don't know. I feel sure that there isn't, but we simply don't know. So consciousness is generated by the reticular system in the brainstem, but experienced throughout the cerebrum. And it's carrying out all these other vital autonomic functions, controlling the autonomic nervous system, the heart, the breathing, the vasomotor tone, and all the other things we mentioned.